April 1865. The Civil War ends. 4 million people walk out of bondage and into a world they've never known. They were told they were free. But what does freedom mean when you have no land, no vote, no protection under law? What happens when the system that enslaved you simply rewrites the rules? This is the story of what came after emancipation. Not the story we were taught in school, but the one written in laws, labor contracts, and prison ledgers. This is what happened when freedom was promised and something else arrived. When the 13th Amendment passed in December 1865, it seemed like a turning point. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Across the South, there were moments of joy. Families searched for loved ones sold away decades before. Black communities built schools, churches, and businesses. For the first time, they could marry legally, move freely, dream of owning land. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to help with the transition, distributing food, negotiating labor contracts, setting up schools. There was hope. But hope is fragile when power hasn't changed hands. Southern elites had lost the war, but they still owned the land. They still controlled state governments, and they still believed in a racial hierarchy that placed them on top. Meanwhile, most freed people had nothing. No savings, no tools, no legal claim to the land they'd worked for generations. There had been talk of 40 acres and a mule, a promise of redistributed land from General Sherman's Field Order 15. But President Andrew Johnson reversed it. The land was given back to former Confederates. And so 4 million people were freed into an economy that still needed their labor, but refused to give them power. The question became, how do you control a free people without calling it slavery? The answer was already written into the Constitution. Let's read that amendment again. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States, except as a punishment for crime. 13 words, one exception. And Southern lawmakers saw an opportunity. In late 1865 and early 1866, state after state passed what became known as the Black Codes. These weren't just laws, they were traps. In Mississippi, any black person without written proof of employment could be arrested for vagrancy. In South Carolina, if you wanted to work as anything other than a farmer or servant, you needed a special license and a white sponsor. In Louisiana, black workers who left their jobs before their contract ended could be arrested and forced to work without pay. The message was clear: you are free to work for us or go to prison. And prison had its own purpose. Once convicted, often for crimes like unemployment or breaking a labor contract, black men were leased out to private companies, coal mines in Alabama, turpentine camps in Florida, railroads in Georgia. They worked 12, 14, 16-hour days. They weren't paid, they weren't protected, and they died. In some states, convict laborers died at 10 times the rate of enslaved people before the war. But here's the difference. Under slavery, an enslaved person was property, valuable, insured. Under convict leasing, prisoners were expendable. If one died, the state would simply lease another. And the system was profitable. States earned revenue, corporations got cheap labor, and no one had to call it slavery because technically it wasn't. It was punishment. For those who avoided prison, another system was waiting: sharecropping. Without land or capital, most freed families had no choice but to work the same plantations they'd just left, now as tenants. They were promised a share of the crop, but the landlord controlled the supplies, the prices, the accounting. At the end of the season, most families were told they owed more than they'd earned. They couldn't leave, because leaving meant breaking the contract, and breaking a contract could mean arrest. It was a cycle: debt to sharecropping to debt, debt to prison, prison to labor. Freedom with no exit. For a brief period, about 12 years, there was a window. During Reconstruction, black men voted, they held office, they built schools and passed laws. Federal troops were stationed in the South to protect these rights, but protection costs political will. And by 1877, the country was tired. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction. Federal troops withdrew, and the South was left to govern itself. What followed was systematic disenfranchisement, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. Violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan went largely unpunished. And the legal framework we've been describing, the Black Codes, Convict Leasing, and Sharecropping, became the foundation for Jim Crow, a system that would last another 80 years. So, let's return to the question. If you can't vote, can't own land, can't move freely, can be arrested for being poor, can be forced to work without pay, are you free? The laws changed, the language changed, but the structure remained. Because freedom isn't just the absence of chains, it's the presence of power. And power, real power, was never transferred. This isn't ancient history. Mass incarceration, prison labor, and unequal justice didn't appear out of nowhere. They have roots, and those roots were planted in 1865. If this story changed the way you see freedom, there's more to explore. So, hit subscribe, leave a comment, share this story, because the past isn't behind us. It's still unfolding.